we're sure this is going to be great.
Thank you. And I really appreciate the invitation. And I thank Rosani and Eduardo for the opportunity to be in touch with you, to keep in touch with you. As Flavia was saying, I've been to Manaus, and I've been to your center several times now. In fact, I was just remembering the impact that my last visit had on my youngest kid. Because as part of my visit, you guys took me to your maker space, and I got a photo of me inside of a video game. And to my kid, that was quite an achievement. He, up to this day, he's a second grader, and up to this day, he cannot understand what I did in order to be inside of a video game. So you made me look like a hero, and I thank you for that. But again, it is great to have the opportunity to keep in touch in spite of all the crazy things that are happening all over the world. In spite of the pandemic, I was just telling you before that I think that my very last international trip I took earlier in the year was to visit you guys in Manaus. So then I came back to Mexico, which is where I live. Don't get fooled by my name. That's the only Brazilian, apart from the love I have for your country. My name is pretty much about it when it comes to Brazilian, the Brazilian infusion in me, if you know what I mean. I was named after a very popular soccer player from the 70s, because my dad was a huge fan, and so he decided to name me after this very popular soccer player of the time. But I was born in Mexico. I was raised in between Mexico and the U.S. I've had the opportunity to live in both countries on and off, because of how close we are, and because of you know, how things are in Mexico, in which this bicultural, bilingual environment, it's pretty much the norm. And so I've been working for National Geographic Learning for over 15 years now, and I can truly assure you that some of my fondest memories working with teachers come from Brazil. And I every time I have the opportunity to visit you guys, it's a joy, and I'm very thankful for the opportunity of keep on doing that, even if it's through digital tools as we are right now. And as you were saying before, the topic that we're going to be talking about today is quite important, because it's something that we all have to deal with at any point when teaching English. We all, whether we're teaching very young kids, or we're teaching young adults, or we're teaching adults, and no matter the proficiency level, at some point, we always end up teaching a bit or a lot of grammar, depending on the lesson, depending on the level of students, depending on the age. But grammar is a constant, as it is the true backbone of language, right? And without grammar, language wouldn't have any sort of cohesion, any sort of coherence. So I remember when I went to college to get my degree as a language teacher, this was early 90s, and back at that time it was all about the natural approach for language teaching and learning. The Stephen Krashen's theory on second language acquisition was very novel, was very recent at the time, and grammar was like evil for a lot of us. We were actually instructed not to teach grammar because grammar was evil. And they told us, you don't need grammar to learn a foreign language. And then research has proved them wrong. And research has demonstrated that at some point, grammar is needed as a natural consequence of language acquisition. Because again, grammar provides cohesion and coherence. So the debate, it's not on whether we have to teach grammar or not. What actually matters is how grammar is taught and the role it plays in your teaching practice. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So as I mentioned before, the point is not should we teach grammar or not. It is pretty obvious that we have to, inductively, deductively, overtly, or covertly, whatever you prefer to teach it, but grammar needs to be a part of your interaction with students, because again, that's what provides cohesion and coherence to language. But what's really important is the how. How is it that we need to teach grammar? How is it that we need to use grammar as a springboard into communication? How is it that we're gonna use grammar as the basis for fluency in language production? Okay, how grammar should always be considered a means to an end and not the end of the practice, if you know what I mean. And that's where I think the problem resides. That for a lot of teachers, including myself at the beginning when I started teaching, grammar was my goal. And I thought that my students were learning English because they were capable of reciting 135 verbs in irregular past. And then I realized, that shouldn't be the goal. The goal should always be for my students to be able to express their thoughts and their ideas cohesively and coherently in English. For that, they do need grammar, on top of many other things also. But grammar, then, it's a means to an end. And that is why I've called this session, and for this, I'm going to share my screen now. I've called this session Building the Bridge from Accuracy to Fluency. Grammar, it's intended to provide accuracy to language practice and production. But then, should we stop there? Or should we use that practice in order to enforce fluent production of language? That's the question we're going to answer today. And so one thing that I would like to put the spotlight on to begin with our discussion today is the way we typically teach grammar. How is it that we typically teach grammar? And there's no right or wrong here, because I'm no one to judge the way you teach grammar. I wouldn't dare judging the way you teach grammar. I'm just curious about which of these 4 ways that I have on the screen is the one that you think it's a bit more familiar, or you're a bit more closer towards when it comes to teaching grammar. So there are many ways to approach teaching grammar structures. Which of these 4 do you use most often? It could be that you explicitly teach the structure and have students to do practice exercises in one context, typically the context that comes in the textbook. Another way would be explicitly teach the structure and have students do practice exercises in various contexts. So you use what comes in the book, and then you bring in other examples, and then you take that context to a different level, etc., etc. It could also be the fact that you introduce a context and pull the structure from the context, and then you practice the structure in that context. Or you might say, I don't have a defined way or a defined position in my practice for teaching grammar. I teach structures only when they occur naturally in a lesson. So using the chat and numbering these 4 options, 1, 2, 3, and 4, which is the one you think it's closer to your grammar teaching approach, if any? And if your answer is none of them, I teach grammar this other way, let me know through the chat, please. Let me open the chat. So it's 1, explicitly teach the structure in one context. 2, explicitly teach the structure in various contexts. 3, introduce the context first and then show students the structure. And then 4, whenever it's needed, I do it occasionally and not systematically. A lot of you are saying 3. Very good. Very good. And again, let me reinforce this. If you're saying it's number 1 or it's number 2, but you don't dare to say it because you think that's wrong, well, let me tell you something. There's no right and wrong here. I've seen fantastic grammar lessons around number 1, in which the teacher teaches the structure explicitly in one context and makes, a fantastic practice out of it. So there's no right and wrong here. It just depends on, the environment and the characteristics of your lesson. Let's say, for example, exactly, thank you, Lucas, number 2 and even number 1, the more complex, the more advanced the grammatical structure gets, typically it's more time consuming to teach inductively. So if you want to go for the quick and dirty, you go with 1 or 2. You present the structure and you're done, right? So very good. And then, yeah, maybe number 4, it's more appealing for teaching younger kids, in which you don't necessarily have to present the structure, but you guide them naturally, right? Into the acquisition of the structure on their own. So absolutely, it is all about control, and it is all about your teaching situation. And as we're gonna see in a minute, it is also about your preferred teaching styles, and believe it or not, the way you were taught grammar when you were a student. We're going to talk about that in a minute as well. But then again, there's no right and wrong, but I really wanted to see which word you were leaning more towards, and I understand it's number 3, which is really cool. No matter the method that you follow for teaching grammar, I always recommend teachers to use grammar again as a means to an end. To consider the grammar practice, no matter if you're doing it inductively or deductively, if you're teaching grammar overtly or covertly, grammar should be envisioned as a means to an end. It should be a part of a meaningful approach in which you're giving your students challenging opportunities to be successful in their language learning experience, so they develop confidence and become independent, lifelong learners. And I'm making an emphasis on this because, again, more traditional grammar practices in which you're only concerned on your students' ability to memorize verbs, for example, that's not a challenging opportunity to be successful in a language learning experience. So yes, we are all about grammar, but when grammar provides students with an opportunity to successfully learn and then produce English in a variety of contexts. So keep this in mind at all times. Grammar is necessary. No matter how you teach it, give your students or use the grammar teaching as an opportunity to provide students with challenging activities to be successful in their language learning experience. And in that same line, you gotta make sure that when you teach grammar, you're not only envisioning lower order thinking skills, but rather higher order thinking skills as well. If you're familiar with, and I thought about, shame on me, because I thought about putting the Bloom's taxonomy graphic on this slide, and I forgot. But if you know what I'm talking about, the taxonomy presents different levels of cognitive practice, different levels of thinking, if you may. And the lower levels, the ones that are more towards the floor, if you may, are not really challenging and not really dynamic, because they're based on memory and understanding or understanding of language. And as you move up the taxonomy ladder, you go more into analyzing, evaluating, producing, and creating. Those are the levels that we need to aim in order to make the grammar practice communicative. But we cannot aim to work critically and cooperatively and to transfer language and thinking skills to any tasks if we don't pay attention to the foundational levels of the taxonomy. In other words, memory and repetition and drilling and mechanic practice of grammar is necessary at the beginning of the process, but should always be accompanied by more challenging activities in order for students to understand that grammar, it's not only about memorizing things, but rather that it's the springboard into original creation and original understanding and creation of language. Okay, so consider this. There are 5 essentials for teaching grammar that I'm about to teach with you. And all of the things that I've said already are gonna make more sense once you get to see those 5 essentials for teaching grammar. The first one is, whenever teaching a new structure, whenever teaching a new tense or a new grammatical function, make sure you establish a context and purpose. Why? Because a grammatical structure by itself, it's completely unmotivating. It's not sexy. It's not dynamic. If you come to your class and tell your students, today we're going to learn about present progressive. What's sexy about present progressive? What's cool about it? Where is the motivation I need in order to pay attention to the practice? But if I contextualize the structure and if I presented my students with a purpose for learning present progressive, that's when magic happens. And I'll show you examples of contextualizing a grammatical structure in a minute. But keep this in mind. Whenever presenting a new grammatical structure, a new tense, a new function, always make sure there's a context embedded and you make it clear to your students of the purpose of learning that grammar item. Okay? That's one. Number 2, provide students with building blocks and skills they need. Make sure that, let's say, if you're teaching a new grammatical structure or a new tense, you present them in building blocks. You chunk things up and don't throw everything on your students' face at once, because they're gonna get scared and discouraged because of the complexity of grammar, the natural complexity of grammar. But when you present the grammatical structure as part of an overall skills practice in which through the grammar practice, they're gonna become better listeners, better speakers, better readers, and better writers, that's again when magic happens. Grammar on its own doesn't actually do the trick. Grammar as part of a greater purpose of communicating or receiving language cohesively and coherently, that's when magic happens. That's number 2. Number 3, provide mechanical and meaningful tasks that allow students to practice the structure. Mechanical practice by themselves are meaningless. Meaningful tasks without mechanical practices before them are extremely hard to comply with. When you combine a process in which you do a bit of a mechanical practice as starters and then you move into more meaningful tasks, that's again when magic happens. And I'll give you examples of this in a minute. And then number 4, whenever teaching grammar, sorry about that. The host muted me for some reason. Uh, maybe
We're
I was
sorry.
just, maybe I was just saying nonsense. Um, no, I'm sure it was a mistake. But anyways, ensure that students are successful. That is, whenever you're teaching grammar, make sure that that grammar practice finishes with a truly communicative production. Otherwise, grammar won't serve to the purpose of producing language cohesively and coherently. And getting success in grammar learning doesn't mean that your student's capable of reciting 135 verbs in base form, present, and irregular past. So if your student's capable of going do, did, done, swim, swam, swum, am, is, are, was, where, been. If your student's capable of doing that, that means that that student has very good memory, but it doesn't prove a thing regarding his or her communicative competence, right? So in order to make sure that the grammar practice has been successful, um, you gotta make sure that your students use grammar communicatively. I have a question in the chat saying, avoiding completely memory skills and some drilling sounds a real mistake, according to neuroscience evidence. Absolutely. Exactly, Josie. That's exactly what I was saying. It has to be a part of a very, very purposeful process in which you begin with mechanical practice like repetition, drilling, etc., etc., but you don't stop there. You move on forward and you use that mechanical practice as the foundation of the upcoming productive stage. The problem is what I've observed, and I'm not saying it's your case because I've never been to your lessons to observe your performance, but what I've observed a lot in many Latin American schools is that teachers get a lot into the mechanical practice. All of a sudden, time is up. Students leave the classroom without having done any communicative practice. And so they go with the idea that grammar is boring, it's tedious, it's tiresome, it's not sexy at all. Grammar, it's a waste of time. A lot of students think that way, and they're not the ones to blame. The problem is that we we never cross the bridge from the mechanical practice to the more meaningful practice. But as absolutely, as Josie says, we cannot get to the meaningful practice without a bit of lower order thinking skills practice, without the mechanical aspect, right? And then when you combine those mechanical and meaningful tasks, that's when you ensure that your students are successfully learning and applying grammar. And then number 5, allow students to use this structure in creative and meaningful ways. Challenge them with productive activities using grammar. Grammar is not just a passive reception of language. Grammar should also include a creative and active productive stage in the lesson. And I'm going to give you examples of that in a minute. Now, moving from those 5 essentials for teaching grammar, let me analyze for a minute what it means for students. And let me change the teaching for the learning. Let's now try to analyze learning grammar from the students' perspectives. Number 1, students learn better within a context. That goes in line with the teaching number 1, remember? Number 2, students learn differently. So a grammar approach that is fabulous for a group of students might be useless and meaningless for another group of students because they learn grammar differently. Number 3, students learn better in manageable chunks. And I'm going to tell you more about chunking grammar in a minute. Number 4, Students learn better by doing activities that move from controlled to open-ended. In other words, students learn better grammar by doing activities that begin at the mechanical practice but move over to communicative, productive activities. And number 5, if students learn how to learn, they will acquire grammar better. If they realize, I have this technique for grammar learning that I really enjoy doing, that's again when magic happens, right? So it's not just you directing the grammar teaching, but it's them owning the grammar learning. And I'll give you examples of this as well, okay? Before we move into practical examples, any questions regarding the 5 essentials for teaching grammar and the 5 essentials for learning grammar? And again, you can use the chat or you can open up your mic. Very good. So I'm going to take that as a so far so good, right? Very good.
So far, it's excellent, Jay. Thank you.
Great. Lovely. So let's take a look at practical ideas on these 5 essentials that I've shared with you. Oh, let me see the chat for a minute. It says, when students have the chance to see it, the grammar, the lesson by themselves before going into the classroom, they can see it in a communicative way. Otherwise, they're just receivers of what exactly. And that's when the flipping concept, I don't know if you're familiar with the whole concept of the flipping methodology or the flipped classroom. Grammar for English language teaching and learning, grammar, it's the ideal language component to flip, because students can approach the grammar presentation and some grammar practice on their own and then come to class ready for application and production of grammar. It doesn't mean that you're not gonna deal with grammar in class, but it means that most of your time will be advocated to practice and production and not introduction and presentation, because they did that on their own. That's the beauty of flipping grammar in English language teaching. That's and there's no right and wrong, because grammar never changes. Present progressive will have the verb to be plus a verb in gerund. No matter the way you want to put it, present progressive will always have the verb to be plus the verb in gerund. So grammar is ideal for flipping because it never actually changes. So no matter the source that students are using for getting familiar with the structure, the content's going to be more or less the same, because grammar is static in that sense, right? So thank you for sharing that. Because yeah, the notion of flipping grammar should always be considered, as grammar teaching, it's time consuming, but most of the time it's typically advocated to introduction and presentation of the structure. And that's why we never have enough time for practice and production in class. When you flip grammar and you allow for students to introduce themselves to the grammatical structure, to present themselves to the grammatical structure, that means that you are releasing time in class time for more productive and communicative tasks, right? Very good. But then, thanks for that. Is it Jader? I'm gonna say it. I'm gonna say it in the English pronunciation. That would be Jader.
Jade. Yes, even
Jader.
Americans, they call me Jay because it's hard for them.
Jader? Okay,
Jade.
there you go. Very good. Well, thank you for that. Very, very insightful comment. Very good. So we were talking about the importance of learning within a context. And let's say, for example, that you're about to teach a new lesson in which they're going to introduce and practice the simple past tense. How would you contextualize a simple past tense lesson? What are the typical ways of contextualizing a simple past lesson? Any ideas? And you don't have to go crazy here. There are very popular and very effective ways for contextualizing, for example, simple past tense teaching. Very popular in textbooks, but I'm curious to see if you can think of any. How would you contextualize the teaching of a simple past tense? I see the chat's blinking. What did you do last weekend? What did you do on your last vacation? Very good. That's the typical way we contextualize. But there's a bit of a risk in contextualizing it that way at the beginning. What would be the risk? If you had a student that's not really highly motivated, that's not fully engaged in the practice, if you ask that student, what did you do on your last vacation? Chances are the answer is going to be nothing. What did you do last weekend? Nothing, right? And it could also be a perfectly valid answer. I see the importance of personalizing the context, but I would save that for later. And before getting into personalizing the grammatical practice, I would go for a more generic possibility. For example, one thing that we've done in a lesson that I've designed for personalizing simple past tense, it's by means of using very popular, yeah, exactly. Thank you, Junior. Very popular world affairs or issues. Do you have any idea of what I have on the screen right now? That's the original cover of the National Geographic magazine issue that announced it to the world that a National Geographic expedition crew had found the Titanic at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Did you know that it was National Geographic, the one that found the remains of the shipwreck, the debris of the shipwreck of the Titanic? It was a National Geographic commanded expedition. And so I decided to use this topic in order to contextualize my teaching of simple past tense. Why? Because it's a safe topic, but at the same time, it's very interesting. There's a lot of evidence, and I can pull in a lot of visual input, a lot of interactive input, including real world photos, including documentaries, including interviews with the actual explorers, etc., etc. And so we ended up creating a full lesson for teaching the simple past using the context of the Titanic. And we have in some other textbooks, we contextualize the teaching of simple past with, for example, Egyptians, or in the Egyptian culture, or the Mayan culture, or the Incas culture, etc., etc. But the point is that you're presenting a context in which students get to develop the grammatical structures further, and then as a step 2, they can personalize it with, okay, we've talked about the explorers finding the Titanic, we've talked about the Mayans, we've talked about the Egyptians, now tell me about yourself. Now that you've got all that language, now that you're familiar with the structure, let's personalize it. Let's go to contextualizing 2.0, if you know what I mean, in which we've talked about these other contexts. Now let's talk about yourselves. What is it that you did last weekend? What did you do over the past summer vacation? And so on and so forth. See what I mean here? So contextualizing is always important. My recommendation would be contextualize with a global topic first, and then funnel that down into a personal practice as step number 2. Okay? Was that clear? Lovely. Fantastic. So another point to consider is the fact that students approach learning differently. And there's a lot of research. You can Google them up. You can Google for Rive, Eisler, Barber, and Strunk. And you're going to find a lot of evidence on this. And they've concluded that in a classroom, students would be approximately 25 to 30% visual, 25 to 30% auditory, 15% tactile kinesthetic, and 25 to 30% have mixed modalities. And this is young adults. Numbers change when we're talking about younger students. So if you're teaching children, they're gonna be more tactile kinesthetic than auditory, for example, right? So, but my point is, consider this. Only 30% of students will remember most of what is said in a classroom lecture. And only another 30% will remember primarily what is seen. In other words, if you really want for your students to learn grammar successfully, you should always present grammar in a variety of modalities. Because grammar, it's typically presented by means of text and audio if we're lucky. The problem is that with that, you're leaving perhaps 50 to 70% of your class out of the learning spectrum. Because if they're not visual or if they're not auditory, that means that the practice is gonna be sort of like meaningless to them. Tell me if I'm wrong, but in many cases, grammar, it's typically presented to students in a logical, mathematical way. Think of it. Typically, when we teach grammar, we end up presenting a table that has a grammatical formula that says, again, for present progressive, you have verb to be plus a verb in gerund, right? And if you're teaching the adverb or if you're teaching adjectives or no matter the structure or the tense you're teaching, we typically present those in the format of a math formula, if you know what I mean. So you have the article, and then you have the adjective, and then you have the noun, and then you have the verb, and then you have the adverb, and then you have the complements, right? It sounds like a mathematical equation, if you know what I mean. There's nothing wrong with that. That's actually a very good way to present grammar. The only problem there is that you're only targeting logical mathematical students. What if you had musical students that need to have tune and rhythm in order to capture the grammatical essence? What if you had bodily kinesthetic students, which means that they need to do something with their hands or their body in order to truly acquire the grammatical notion? So my point is, at the moment of teaching grammar, consider a variety of presentation and practice activities that include text, audio, maybe a song, maybe a reading, maybe a discussion. So you are targeting many different styles, or as Gardner called them, intelligences, right? And in that way, you're not leaving a lot of students behind, because at some point, they're gonna find something that captures their attention in your grammar lesson. Was that clear? Very good. You promise?
Yes.
Cross your heart? Lovely. Number 3. Oh, before we get into number 3, what I was telling you about how students approach learning differently. Remember at the end that we're all different. Our students are all different. Each class we teach is different. If we're truly conscious of our students' needs, our classes for the same course taught from semester to semester, from period to period, must change because our students' needs are necessarily different. This means that our delivery may change. We may emphasize different aspects of the content, and we may approach instruction in a variety of ways. And I'm telling you this because I visited a lot of schools in which when they use, let's say, a grammar practice handout, it turns out that that handout is a photocopy of an original handout that was created perhaps 10 or 12 years ago. And the teacher says, I wrote this myself 12 years ago, but you wrote that handout for the students you had at the time. And since it worked out really well the first time you used it, you keep on using it. There's nothing wrong with reusing, but we have to adapt. Whatever we have, we need to adapt it to our students' current needs and conditions. Because at the end, what worked really well with a class last year might not work that well with a class this year. Why? Because our students' needs and styles and preferences might be different, right? So I'm telling you this because it is very typical, it's very customary that we reuse a lot of the grammar handouts and the grammar activities that we created years ago. There's nothing wrong with that when you take the time to adapt or edit, take in, take out content depending on your students' present needs and preferences. Okay? Was that clear? Lovely. Let me see the chat here. And the circumstances are always different too. Take the pandemics, for instance. Absolutely, Saida. I'm totally with you on that one. Exactly. So we always need to pay attention to the way our students are gonna approach the learning, not only of grammar. This applies to all the different systems and skills when we teach the language. Very good. Now, let's talk for a second about manageable chunks. What theory has demonstrated, what research has made evident is that the more we chunk the grammatical structure, the bigger the chances for our students to acquire it. In other words, right now I'm teaching simple present verb to be. But if you look at the chart I have on the screen right now, I'm only concentrating on what? What aspect of subject plus be am I concentrating on in the chart? Any answers? Am I teaching all affirmatives, negatives, and interrogatives at once? Or am I just focused on one?
Affirmative.
Affirmatives, exactly. I'm only concerned about teaching affirmatives. Why? Because again, research has shown that if I presented the whole grammar spectrum to my students at once, that would become extremely hard for them to manage. But if I chunk things up and I say, okay, for the first 25 minutes, we're just gonna concentrate on affirmatives. We're gonna practice this, we're gonna work on a bit of mechanical practice, if you may, with affirmatives, and then I'm gonna present my students with negatives, right? I'm gonna use the same chart, but I'm gonna show them where to include the negative in the statement, right? And so I'm still working on the same structure. It's subject plus be, but in this case, I'm now including not only the affirmative, but also the negative. And then maybe next class, I'm gonna concentrate on interrogatives. There is a benefit on chunking things up. And that benefit is that your students are going to have the opportunity to concentrate and master one particular trait of the grammatical structure at a time. And in that way, even assessment becomes simpler. There's a big difference when you don't chunk things up and you present your students with the full grammatical spectrum at once. They feel discouraged and they feel that they cannot deal with the excessive amount of information at once. So my recommendation is, whenever introducing a new grammatical structure, chunk things up. Concentrate on affirmative first. It could be the same lesson, but concentrate on affirmative first, and then after the affirmative has been presented and briefly practiced, introduce the negative. And after the affirmative and the negative have been introduced and briefly practiced, then you can introduce the interrogative, etc., etc. Okay? But that's when you manage chunks of the grammatical structure for your students' benefit. All right? And on that same line, it's number 4. Students learn better by doing activities that move from controlled to open-ended. And as I mentioned before, there's always room for mechanical practice. And there's even theories that claim that your students will never get to build any fluency if you didn't provide them with solid mechanical practices at the beginning. So mechanical practices are needed, but just briefly as an introduction to language production. So you go from mechanical to meaningful to communicative to open-ended. You develop accuracy through the mechanical practice. Then you start developing fluency with meaningful activities. You master fluency with communicative activities, and then you challenge students to apply that accuracy and fluency that was presented before in real life situations. Okay? So this notion has a lot to do with Diane Larson Freeman's framework for grammar teaching and learning. Remember, the whole grammar spectrum must include 3 items in order to be considered successful. The form's needed, and you teach the form mechanically. But the form by itself won't do anything for fluency communicative development. When you jump from the form to make sure students understand the meaning of the grammatical structure, what it means and when it can be used, that's when, again, magic happens. So the form, it's the mechanical practice. The meaning is the meaningful practice. And then communication and open-ended activities are geared towards the use of grammar. The problem, again, that I've observed in many lessons is that most teachers stay here on the form. And they very rarely provide students with opportunities to make sure they understand the meaning, let alone having original opportunities for using the grammatical structure in real life settings. If you neglect students with the opportunity of practicing the use of grammar in classroom, they're never gonna develop the fluency needed for real life interactions. So again, go from mechanical to meaningful to communicative to open-ended. Make sure when you teach grammar, make sure that you present the form, again, inductively or deductively, overtly or covertly, but you present the form, you make sure they understand the meaning, and they have opportunities for using that grammatical structure in highly communicative, highly productive activities. Okay? And then that's when you get to that eternal discussion. What should be focused more in grammar teaching, accuracy of fluency. The problem is that if you said, you know, I'm gonna stress fluency practice. I'm gonna give my students a lot of productive activities. I'm not gonna pay much attention to grammar because I want for them to produce. The problem with that is that a lot of their fluent production won't have any accuracy and eventually won't make any sense. Because again, for language to make sense, it needs to be at some point accurate. Otherwise, it's gonna be a bunch of nonsense. Beautifully pronounced, but nonsense at the end, if you know what I mean. The opposite would be, no, I want for my students to have perfect grammar. I'm gonna master tenses. I'm gonna make sure they use the form 100% correctly, but then again, they're gonna lack fluency. They're gonna know a lot about English, but very little English, if you know what I mean. So the idea is that you balance the approach. How can you balance the approach? How can you make sure that you consider accuracy and fluency together? Again, following this set of steps. Begin with mechanical. Go for meaningful. Make sure they communicate with the grammatical structure, and at the end, challenge them with open-ended activities. Let me give you some examples on this. Remember that before we jump into the examples, because I know that my time's almost up, before we jump into examples, remember that the acquisition of grammar begins with exposing your students, again, a bit mechanically to the structure. But the actual learning happens with communicative practice. And the more they recycle and expand the practice, the stronger the acquisition of the grammatical structure is gonna be. So present your students to mechanical practice. Make sure they learn through communicative activities and recycle and expand grammar as many times as possible. Okay? Oh, fantastic. Thanks for letting me know. I was gonna get into a hurry here. Beautiful. Great. So that is what you gotta keep in mind. Now, easier said than done, right? Let me show you some examples of what I mean with all this theory that I presented. And let's begin with this idea of establishing context and present grammar points. This is a really nice lesson that I found on a textbook by Rob Jenkins, in which he is introducing the grammatical structure of comparatives. So the main objective of the lesson is making comparisons, but he's contextualizing the comparative structure with digital electronical appliances, right? So he introduces the topic of making comparisons by not even working with grammar at the beginning. He begins with vocabulary. And you see here, headphone jack, keyboard, power cable jack, screen, etc., etc. So he concentrates on contextualizing the structure with, in this case, electronic appliances or utilities. And then he moves into a more communicative practice in which he presents students with this chart. So we have over here, we have 5 different types of computers: GCN, Toshiba, Vintel, Shipland, and Contact. And you have this, you have the data, the price, the screen size, the speed, the memory, the hard drive. And so students can start saying things like, the Contact is cheaper than the GCN. So naturally, they're going to start developing the grammatical structure based on the context, right? So they can say things like, I don't know, GCN has a bigger screen than Chipland, or GCN has less memory than Toshiba. So in that context that he decided to use, he is implementing the very meaningful grammatical practice, right? So that is how you contextualize. And another one that I really liked, because it didn't involve anything but the student textbook, is this one here. In this particular example, the activity, it's contextualizing the use of there is and there are. But the context is done only with the textbook in hand. So I'm going to ask my students to analyze the textbook they're using in order to answer or fill in the gaps here. There are pages in this textbook. So the only thing students need to do is get their book and see that there are 168 pages on that textbook, and that's what they're going to write down. I'm contextualizing with what I have on my hands, right? Look at the table of contents. There are units in this textbook. I'm contextualizing the practice with something that it's tangible and that I have on my hand. There is a grammar chart section that begins on page, and then they look for the grammar chart on a page and they write the number. It's a simple, very easy way to contextualize the grammatical practice with something that it's tangible, that it's evident, and that is accessible. Because typically, there are practice has to do with there are clouds in the sky. There is a pencil in my backpack. And things that are, yeah, maybe real, but not tangible or accessible. So when you contextualize, you can establish the context with something that is on your students' hands in order to make the practice more memorable and more meaningful. Was that clear? Any questions regarding establishing context?
This in particular is very good, isn't it? Simple and effective.
Very simple, exactly, and extremely effective. And there's no way for students to tell you, I don't know, because the answer, it's right there on their hands. Very simple, very effective, exactly. Then chunking. Remember, we talked about this. Now I'm chunking the model can. I'm only gonna concentrate on the affirmative, and then after the affirmative has been presented, I'm gonna then introduce the negative. But before introducing the negative, the first part of the chunking has to do with presenting and then having a brief practice. And the practice is very mechanical, right? So I'm going to ask my students to unscramble the words and write sentences, all in affirmative, because that's the only type of using the modal can I presented already. And then as step 2, I go into negative. And then I present the negative and I use a mechanical practice for that negative that I just presented, right? So when you chunk like this, it might sound a bit more time consuming at the beginning, but the time you're investing in chunking, it's time you're saving on going over and over the same structure because students didn't get it at the beginning because of the amount of information that you originally presented. So I know that at first, it might sound a bit more time consuming when you chunk, but then when you start using it, you realize that it's actually faster in the sense that you don't have to go over and over the entire explanation many times. You can just refer to whatever the type of grammar practice or presentation students seem to fail practicing, okay? And then from that mechanical practice, and I'm gonna stick to the can for abilities. Remember, we talked about affirmative can, and we did a mechanical practice with affirmative can. Then I presented negative can, and we did a mechanical practice with negative can. Enough with mechanical practice. Let's now jump into more meaningful practice, right? So for a meaningful practice, I'm gonna ask my students to take a look at this chart. And I have 3 people with 3 different professions. They all work at the same place. They work at the doctor's office. John is the doctor, Mary is the nurse, and Carlos is the receptionist or the clerk, right? And I'm enlisting the things they do as part of their job. And then I'm gonna challenge my students to write sentences using can or can't with the information provided. So they're gonna say things that the doctor can't prescribe medication because it's included here, but the nurse can't diagnose illnesses. The nurse can assist the doctor, but the nurse cannot perform surgery, right? But notice how I'm not giving my students a drill. I'm just presenting them with facts, and they're the ones in charge of creating the sentences on their own. It's, I would call this activity controlled meaningful practice, because I'm on control of the data, but students have the opportunity to use it meaningfully, creating their own sentences. See my point here? So it's not as mechanical as this one. It's more meaningful, but there's still a bit of control in this practice, right? From here, we jump into meaningful and communicative. I'm not gonna provide my students with a lot of data anymore. Take a look at the example. It says, think of one profession. Tell your partner 2 or 3 things you can do in order to do well at the job. Ask your partner to guess the profession. So for example, student A is gonna say like, I can type and I can answer phones. And student B is gonna say, are you a secretary? Or if you wanna do the affirmative, you can say, you are a secretary. And then student A is gonna say, yes. Completely meaningful, very communicative, geared towards fluency. We're not doing the mechanical fill in the gaps anymore. We're opening the spectrum to students' creativity and imagination. Step 2, now think of another profession. What is one thing you can't do in order to use the negative? Choose something that makes it easy to guess the profession. Tell your partner. And again, you can say things like, I can check patient's temperature, but I cannot perform surgery. And then maybe they're gonna say, you're a doctor's assistant, or you're a nurse, or things like that. And finally, for an even more communicative practice, in a group, imagine you have a company. Identify the names of 4 jobs within the company. List the duties of each job and discuss what each employee can do. This is as communicative and productive as it gets, right? You're not even framing your students' imagination and creativity. You are making sure that they're using the grammatical structure, can and can't for abilities, but in a way that you're not restraining their initiative and their imagination. And in that way, we've moved from very controlled and mechanical to extremely open-ended and communicative. And with that, we've targeted accuracy, and we're also promoting fluency. See my point here? Very good. Another example. For application, for fluency development, play a round robin. In a group, maybe 4 or 5 students, each in turn writes one thing he or she can do. Think of something interesting or unusual you can do with no names. And then, very simple, I can play the flute, I can perform surgery, I can fly a plane, I can do sign language, I can eat 100 tacos, whatever you want to write down. And then say, exchange papers with another group and identify who wrote which sentence. This is, of course, at the basic level, because again, we're teaching can and can't for abilities. But the idea is that you're not framing your students' practice with just mechanical activities, but rather you're aiming for meaningful communicative practice geared towards fluency development. Okay? That's how we build the bridge from accuracy with mechanical practices to fluency with meaningful, communicative, open-ended activities. Okay? At the end, and in order to call it a day and open up the floor for questions, whenever I'm about to teach a grammatical lesson, I try to think of it in the grander way, in the big picture. And I make sure that my teaching of grammar, number one, establishes a context. I don't teach grammar without having a very meaningful, purposeful, relevant context for my students to work on. Then I make sure that I present limited concepts. In other words, that I chunk the grammatical structure up. Number three, I make sure that every chunk it's practiced mechanically and then meaningfully and finally communicatively. I check for understanding in preparation for application, and my last activity will always be application. Something that has to do with my students' lives, something that will take them out of the practice of the book and into using their own information productively. In this way, I can guarantee to you that the bridge from accuracy to fluency will be not only built, but also crossed by all of your students. Okay? Very good. And on that note, questions? Have you got any questions? And by the way, I saw that some of you were snapping photos of the screen. You're more than welcome to do that. But if you want to get a copy of this presentation, just drop me a line and I'll send you the file.
Thank you very much.
So you can have the full PowerPoint for you to analyze further.
Thank you very much. This will be awesome. Teachers, would you like to take the opportunity to ask Jair questions related to the topic? Grammar, accuracy, fluency. Everyone is thanking you.
I know. Thank you. Thank you for thanking me. I really appreciate it.
As always, you know, this was great. This was awesome, fantastic. And thank you so much for making it clear to us, for reminding us how grammar should be considered as a means to an end.
Right.
The end is communicative competence. It is always good to remember that.
And this is, I've always thought of this as back to basics, if you know what I mean. It's like we're so immersed in the teaching of 21st century skills, and we're all about, you know, implementing technology in our classes, that we tend to forget about the basics. And I'm a big advocate of going back to basics, teaching grammar communicatively, lesson planning, which is another aspect that I always enforce as the very important foundations of successful language teaching and learning.
Okay,
so thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, and thank you for reminding us also and reinforcing the fact that a variety of approaches is important when dealing with grammar.
Absolutely.
Right? Using a variety of approaches. So important, so relevant. And I thought it was awesome when you also reminded us of this importance of in a 60-minute class or in a 90-minute class to have a balance.
Yes.
Of accuracy and fluency activity.
It could even be one of each, one activity of each, but make sure that you don't let students believe that grammar, it's only mechanical, because when that fossilizes, when students end the lesson and leave the classroom thinking, well, grammar is only, you know, a bunch of fill in the gap activities and memorizing exercises, that's when they start truly believing that grammar is useless and it's meaningless, and that in itself is terrible, right? So yeah, finding a way to balance things out, even if it's just one mechanical activity and then one meaningful activity, would actually benefit your students greatly.
Thank you. Very, very, very well remembered. Thank you very much, Felix. Maris, over to you.
Thank you, Shari. It was wonderful. And it was more wonderful because Zaire and I, we have the same language of saying, make it simple, make it simple, make it works, make it in chunks. So I think it was very important to hear this from you also, you know, and I think that the teachers got the message, all right, and they have been practicing a lot of that here and improving all the time, especially when we have this talk. I think you were very practical, you know, very direct to your presentation. That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry, it was not my intention to mute you, but somebody was at the door and then I was going to open. I think you open it first.
Don't worry, absolutely.
So when I touched it, it was mute.
Yeah,
sorry.
That's completely understood. Completely understood.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Hope to hear from you soon. And again, drop me a line and I'll share the presentation with you all.
Oh, great. Wonderful.
I'll be doing this now.
Lovely. Great.
Have fun in Mexico. Eat a taco for us.
I will. Thank you very much. And stay safe.
You too. Yes. Thank you.
Bye.
Obrigada, Jair.
My
Muito
pleasure.
obrigada, Nachel. And thank you, Eduardo and Laísa. It was great. Muito obrigada.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo.